I spent 6 years building a life for one moment, and last Thursday at 5 a.m. it finally came. My sister Caitlin got married 3 weeks ago. Beautiful venue, 200 guests, open bar, the whole deal. I showed up in the suit I bought specifically for this occasion, brought a card with $500 cash inside because that's what you do for family weddings, right? I was genuinely happy for her. Pierce seemed like a decent guy when I met him at their engagement party last year, and seeing her excited about something felt good after all the family drama we'd grown up with. I need to back up. I'm 34 now. When I was 28, I was working as a maintenance technician at an office complex, making about $32,000 a year. Not great money, but steady work. I had my own apartment, paid my bills, kept to myself mostly. My cat Gideon was basically my only real company outside of work, which, yeah, I know how that sounds, but he's a good listener and doesn't judge me for eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. My family had this thing where they treated me like I was perpetually failing at life. Mom would introduce me to her friends as her son, who's still figuring things out, even though I had a job and paid rent. Dad made comments about how I should have gone to college like Caitlin did. Never mind that I'd explained a dozen times I didn't want student loans. Caitlin herself acted like I was this embarrassing relative she had to acknowledge at holidays but would rather not. But the wedding was something else entirely. I got there early because I figured I'd help if they needed anything. Set up chairs, move tables, whatever. Caitlin saw me walk in and her face did this thing where she looked annoyed that I existed. I handed her the envelope with the card and the $500. She opened it right there in front of the gift table while I was still standing next to her. She looked at the cash, looked at me, and then walked over to where the DJ was setting up his equipment. She said something to him and he handed her the microphone. The sound system wasn't fully on yet, so there was this feedback screech that got everyone's attention. Then she just started talking into the mic about how her loser brother apparently thinks money he probably stole makes up for existing. I stood there trying to process what was happening. Mom was sitting at a table near the front, and she actually yelled across the room that $500 was more than I make in a month at my little janitor job. Dad stood up from his chair and announced to everyone that I probably don't even still have that job since I get fired every 6 weeks. Pierce's brother was standing near them, and he asked if I was the one with no friends. Caitlin nodded and told everyone I talked to my cat and that it's actually disturbing. Mom kept going, saying she tells the neighbors I moved to Canada because it's easier than explaining why I'm 34 and alone. The DJ laughed into his microphone. 200 people heard all of this. 200 people who were supposed to be there celebrating my sister's wedding watched my entire family publicly humiliate me for trying to give her a wedding gift. I could see some of them recording on their phones. A few people were laughing. Most just looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything to stop it. I put the envelope back on the gift table, buttoned my jacket, and walked out to the parking lot. I got in my 2019 Toyota Camry that I'd saved up for and paid cash for, and I drove away. I didn't speed. I didn't slam anything. I just left. Here's what they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to find out because they were too busy deciding who I was without asking. 6 years ago, right after Caitlin's college graduation party, where Dad spent an hour telling everyone how proud he was of his successful daughter while I stood in the corner, I made a decision. I was done trying to get them to see me as anything other than their designated failure. But I wasn't going to cut them off or make some dramatic statement. I was going to build something, and I was going to wait. I started taking online courses in HVAC certification and building management, kept working my maintenance job during the day, studied at night, got certified as an HVAC technician, then got additional certifications in electrical and plumbing. Within 2 years, I wasn't just doing basic maintenance, I was doing skilled trade work that paid almost double. I moved into a better apartment, started saving serious money. Then 3 years ago, I took a job as a building operations manager at a mid-sized commercial property. Salary jumped to $68,000. I kept taking courses, got certified in facility management, started networking with property management companies. Last year, I moved into a facilities director position overseeing 3 properties. My salary is $92,000 now, plus benefits and performance bonuses. I drive a car I own. I have a retirement account. I have savings. I have a career with upward trajectory. And yeah, I still have Gideon because having a cat doesn't make you pathetic no matter what my family thinks, but I never corrected them. Every time Mom asked how work was going, I said fine. Every time Dad made comments about my lack of ambition, I nodded. Every time Caitlin acted embarrassed by me, I let her. Because I was waiting for this exact moment. I knew eventually there would be an event where they'd go too far. A wedding, a holiday. Something public where their need to put me down would override basic decency. I'd been preparing for years for what I'd do when it happened. So when I got home from the wedding at 7 in the morning, I wasn't surprised to see text messages starting to come through, first from Caitlin's phone, then from Mom's number, then from Dad's. They were all variations of the same thing about how it was just jokes, and I was being too sensitive, and I needed to come back because people were asking where I went. I didn't respond. I'd spent 6 years getting ready for this, and there was no way I was rushing it now. By 8 a.m., my phone was ringing constantly. I turned the ringer off and went to sleep. When I woke up at 3 in the afternoon, I had 47 missed calls and God knows how many text messages. I made myself lunch, fed Gideon, and finally looked at my phone properly. The messages had gotten increasingly frantic. Caitlin sent several long paragraphs about how she didn't mean it that way, and everyone thought I was being dramatic. Mom called me 6 times in a row. Dad left a voicemail saying I was ruining Caitlin's wedding day by making it about me. Then, around 11 a.m., the messages changed. Caitlin sent one saying the photographer wanted family photos and I needed to be there. Mom sent one saying I was being selfish. Dad sent one saying if I didn't show up for photos, he'd never forgive me. I deleted them all without responding. Sunday morning, 2 days after the wedding, I woke up to someone banging on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw all three of them standing there. Caitlin still in casual clothes, but Mom and Dad dressed like they'd come from church. I didn't open the door. Dad yelled through the door that I needed to stop being childish and talk to them. Mom said they'd driven all the way across town. Caitlin said she just wanted to understand why I was acting like this. I sat on my couch and waited for them to leave. After about 15 minutes, they did. That afternoon, I got a phone call from Pierce. I almost didn't answer, but I was curious what he'd have to say since he barely knew me. He asked if I was okay and said what happened at the wedding was messed up. Then he said Caitlin was really upset and maybe I should consider talking to her because this was supposed to be the happiest time of her life. I told him I appreciated the call, but I wasn't interested in discussing it, then hung up. The messages kept coming. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Caitlin sent me Instagram DMs since I wasn't responding to texts. Mom tried calling from Dad's phone thinking I'd answer a different number. Dad sent me an email to my personal account that I barely use. They wanted me to explain why I was upset. They wanted me to understand it was all in good fun. They wanted me to stop punishing Caitlin for one mistake on her special day. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't upset. I was ready. This wasn't some emotional reaction where I needed time to cool off. This was the beginning of something I'd been planning for 6 years, and their desperation to fix it just proved they finally realized they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Thursday morning at 4:47 a.m., exactly 1 week after I left the wedding, someone started banging on my apartment door and screaming. I got up and looked through the peephole. All three of them were there again. Caitlin was crying. Mom looked frantic. Dad was the one pounding on the door. They were yelling about how I needed to stop doing this, how I was tearing the family apart, how they didn't understand what I wanted from them. Caitlin was sobbing something about being sorry and needing me to please just talk to her. Mom kept saying she was my mother and I owed her a conversation. I recorded all of it on my phone through the peephole. Then I sat back down on my couch and waited for them to leave. They didn't leave. They stayed there for almost an hour, alternating between begging and demanding, between apologies and accusations. My neighbor from across the hall actually opened their door at one point and asked if everything was okay. Dad told them to mind their own business. The building's security guard showed up around 5:30 a.m. because of the noise complaints. I heard him tell them they needed to leave or he'd call the police for disturbing the peace. Dad argued with him. Mom started crying. Caitlin just kept saying my name over and over. Eventually, they left. I still haven't responded to any of them. Not because I'm processing my emotions or deciding what to do. Because the revenge I've been planning doesn't start with me engaging with them on their terms. It starts with them realizing that the person they've spent 34 years treating like a failure has the power to completely shut them out, and there's nothing they can do about it. And honestly, watching them spiral while I go about my normal life has been more satisfying than I expected. I went to work this week like usual, had dinner with a coworker on Tuesday, took Gideon to the vet for his annual checkup on Wednesday. Meanwhile, my family is imploding, trying to figure out how to fix something they don't even understand is broken. But this is just the beginning. They humiliated me in front of 200 people. They made me the punchline of a wedding that those guests will remember forever. They did it because they genuinely believed I was so worthless that publicly destroying me was acceptable entertainment. Now they're about to find out exactly who I actually am. And what happens when you spend 6 years underestimating someone who's been quietly planning for this exact moment? Update 1. Okay, so this blew up way more than I expected, and some of you had questions about what I'm actually planning to do. So let me explain what's been happening since that 5 a.m. meltdown at my door. First, shout out to everyone who pointed out that my family showing up screaming at my apartment at dawn is absolutely unhinged behavior. You're right. And honestly, it confirmed everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. They're not sorry about what they did. They're panicking because for the first time in their lives, I'm not playing along with their narrative about who I am. So here's what happened after they finally left my building that Thursday morning. I went to work like normal, checked my personal email during lunch, and found a 12-paragraph message from Mom explaining how she's always supported me and doesn't understand why I'm trying to hurt the family like this. The whole thing was basically her rewriting history to make herself the victim. She brought up stuff from when I was in high school, talking about how she'd always believed in me even when I struggled with math class, completely ignoring that she spent my entire 20s telling people I was a disappointment. I didn't respond. Friday afternoon, Caitlin showed up at my workplace. I don't know how she found out where I work since I'd never told her the specific company, but I'm guessing she went through my LinkedIn profile or something. She walked into the main lobby and asked the receptionist for me by name. The receptionist called up to my office and asked if I was available for a visitor. I asked who it was, and when she said Caitlin, I told her to let her know I was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. The receptionist was great about it. Very professional. Just relayed the message. Caitlin apparently didn't leave. She sat in the lobby for 2 hours waiting for me to come down. My coworker Peter saw her there when he was leaving for the day and texted me asking if I knew there was a woman in the lobby who looked like she'd been crying. I told him it was a family situation and I was handling it. Around 5:30, the receptionist called again saying Caitlin was insisting she just needed 5 minutes and wasn't leaving until she talked to me. I told the receptionist that I appreciated her patience, but this person wasn't on any visitor list for me, and if she didn't leave, they should contact building security. 10 minutes later, the receptionist called back to say Caitlin had left. That night, I got a voice message from Pierce. He sounded frustrated, said Caitlin had come home devastated from trying to see me at work, and asked what exactly I wanted from this situation, because they couldn't fix something if I wouldn't tell them what was wrong. He said he was trying to stay neutral, but it seemed like I was being deliberately cruel at this point, and maybe I should think about whether this is really how I want to handle family conflict. The thing is, Pierce genuinely doesn't get it. He married into this family 3 weeks ago. He has no context for the 34 years of accumulated garbage that led to that wedding moment. All he sees is his new wife crying because her brother won't talk to her. He doesn't understand that Caitlin spent our entire lives making sure everyone knew I was the lesser sibling, and the wedding microphone incident wasn't some isolated mistake. It was just the first time she did it so publicly that I had justification to respond, but I wasn't ready to explain any of that to Pierce. So I didn't call him back either. Saturday morning, Mom called me from a number I didn't recognize. I picked up thinking it might be work-related since I didn't have the number saved. As soon as I heard her voice, I hung up. She called back immediately, and I let it go to voicemail. She left a message saying she'd borrowed her friend Sally's phone because she knew I wasn't answering her calls, and that this had gone on long enough, and Dad's birthday was coming up in 2 weeks, and I needed to get over myself before then because the family wasn't going to let me ruin another important event. Dad's birthday. That's what this was really about. See, my parents throw this big birthday party for Dad every year at their house. Usually about 40 people, mostly Dad's golf buddies and some extended family. It's this whole thing where Dad holds court and everyone tells him how great he is. Caitlin always comes, brings a nice gift, makes a toast. It's one of those family traditions that exists mostly so Dad can feel important. And here's the thing I haven't mentioned yet. The piece that makes this whole situation more complicated than just me ignoring their calls. My parents live in a house that I co-own with them. 10 years ago, when I was 24 and still doing basic maintenance work, my grandfather died and left his house to me and Caitlin equally. It was a 3-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood, fully paid off. The plan was we'd sell it and split the money, but right when we were about to list it, Dad lost his job. He was 56 at the time and having trouble finding new work. Mom was working part-time at a dental office, but not making enough to cover their rent. They asked if they could live in the inherited house temporarily while they got back on their feet. Caitlin immediately said no. She wanted her half of the sale money for a down payment on her own place. But I didn't need the money urgently, and I felt bad about Dad's situation, so I worked out an arrangement. I bought out Caitlin's half, using money I'd saved plus a small loan. Then, I let our parents live there with the agreement that they'd pay me monthly rent equivalent to what they'd been paying at their apartment. And eventually, when they were in better financial shape, we'd work out either selling the house and splitting the proceeds, or them buying me out or some other arrangement. They've been living there for 10 years. Dad found a new job within 8 months. Mom went full-time at the dental office. They've been financially stable for 9 years. They've never once brought up buying me out. They've never suggested selling. They pay me rent every month, $900, which is probably 300 below market rate for that area now. And they've just acted like that house is theirs. I never pushed it because I was waiting for the right moment when I'd need leverage, waiting for them to do something that would justify me using the one piece of actual power I had in this family dynamic. The wedding gave me that moment. Monday morning, I sent a formal email to both of my parents from my personal email account. Very professional, very clear. I stated that effective immediately I was ending our rental arrangement, and they had 60 days to vacate the property per our state's landlord-tenant laws. I explained that I would be listing the house for sale, and they were welcome to make an offer to purchase it at market value if they wished. But regardless, they needed to be out by the end of the 60-day period. I sent the email at 9 a.m. By 9:15, my phone was ringing. I ignored it. By 9:30, I had 17 text messages. I turned off notifications. At noon, I got a call from Caitlin. She was screaming into the phone before I could even say hello. She wanted to know what was wrong with me, how I could do this to our parents over a stupid joke at her wedding. Did I understand that they couldn't afford to move? Where did I expect them to go? What kind of person uses homelessness as a weapon against their own family? I let her finish her whole rant without interrupting. Then I told her that I was the legal owner of the property, that our parents had been living there for a decade, without ever following through on buying it, and that I had every right to sell my own asset. I reminded her that she'd wanted to sell it 10 years ago anyway, and only didn't because I bought her out to help the family. I said if she felt so strongly about it, maybe she should offer to let them move in with her and Pierce. She hung up on me. That afternoon, Dad showed up at my apartment building. The security guard called up to ask if I was expecting a visitor named Peter. I said no and to not let him up. Dad apparently tried to argue with the guard about how he was my father, and this was an emergency. The guard told him without my approval he couldn't enter the building. I watched on the building's security camera app as Dad stood outside the entrance for 20 minutes, trying to call me over and over before finally leaving. Tuesday evening, I got a text from Pierce asking if we could meet in person to discuss the house situation, because Caitlin's parents were beside themselves, and he wanted to understand my perspective. He suggested we meet at a diner near his and Caitlin's apartment on Wednesday evening. I agreed. Not because I wanted to negotiate, but because I was curious what approach they'd take. Wednesday at 7 p.m., I met Pierce at the diner. He was already in a booth when I got there, looking uncomfortable. He asked how I was doing in this way that was trying to be friendly, but you could tell he was stressed. I ordered coffee and told him I was fine. He spent about 10 minutes trying to do this mediator thing where he acknowledged that what happened at the wedding was wrong, but also tried to suggest that my response was disproportionate. He said Caitlin felt terrible, and my parents were genuinely scared about losing their home. He asked what it would take for me to reconsider the eviction notice. I explained very calmly that the wedding wasn't really about one incident. I laid out the 34 years of context, gave him specific examples of the ways my family had treated me like a failure, while I was actually building a career they knew nothing about because they never asked. I told him about every dismissive comment, every introduction where Mom called me her son who was still figuring things out, every family gathering where Dad made jokes about my lack of ambition. Pierce listened, but you could see he was trying to find the middle ground. He kept saying things like he understood that must have been hurtful, but families have complicated dynamics, and didn't I think there were better ways to address this than making my parents homeless? I told him they wouldn't be homeless. They had 60 days to find a new place, and they both had jobs. I said I'd been more than generous letting them live in my house for a decade at below market rent. He asked if I'd consider extending the deadline to 90 days to give them more time to find something affordable. I said no. He asked if there was any amount of apology that would change my mind. I said no. He got quiet for a minute and then asked what I actually wanted out of this whole situation. Like, what was my end game? And that's when I realized Pierce was never going to understand, because what I wanted wasn't something he could give me or negotiate for. What I wanted was for my family to finally understand that I wasn't the person they decided I was, that I'd spent 6 years becoming someone they completely underestimated, that their own arrogance and cruelty had created a situation where I now held all the power and they had zero leverage. I told Pierce I appreciated him trying to help, but this wasn't something that could be mediated. Then I paid for my coffee and left. That night, Caitlin sent me a series of Instagram DMs. She'd clearly been drinking based on the typos and the rambling nature of the messages. She said I was destroying the family over my own insecurities. She said I'd always been jealous of her, and this was just me finally finding a way to punish everyone for my own failures. She said kicking our parents out of their home wasn't going to make me less pathetic or give me actual friends or fix whatever was broken in me that made me so angry all the time. Then she said if I went through with the eviction, she'd make sure everyone in the family knew exactly what kind of person I really was. I screenshot all of it. Didn't respond. Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks after the wedding, I got a Facebook message request from Mom's Waitwa sister, my Aunt Gemma. We hadn't talked in probably 5 years. She wanted to know if the rumors were true that I was evicting my parents, and if so, could we please talk because she was sure this was all a misunderstanding. I declined the message request. And here's where things get interesting. Because I realized that my family is now doing exactly what I expected them to do. They're trying to mobilize other family members to pressure me. They're reaching out to anyone they think might have influence. They're building this narrative where I'm the villain having a breakdown instead of someone making a calculated business decision about my own property. Which means they still don't get it. They still think this is about emotions I need to process instead of a plan I've been ready to execute for years. The 60-day clock is ticking. My parents have 46 days left to find a new place to live, and based on the increasingly frantic attempts to contact me, they're finally starting to understand that I'm not bluffing. Some of you asked what the actual revenge is. This is it. Not some elaborate scheme, just me finally using the one piece of leverage I've had all along and refusing to let them guilt me out of it. They wanted to humiliate me publicly. Now they get to explain to everyone why their son is evicting them, and every explanation is going to require them to admit what they did at that wedding. Part 3 coming soon, because Dad's birthday party is in 9 days, and I'm very curious to see if they're still planning to have it. Update 2. All right, buckle up because the last week has been absolutely wild, and I need to walk you through exactly what went down with Dad's birthday party and the fallout that's still happening. So when I left off, my parents had 46 days to move out, and the family was starting to mobilize against me. That's continued and escalated in ways I honestly didn't fully anticipate, even though I knew they'd try something. First thing Monday morning, 5 days after my coffee meeting with Pierce, I got a text from Caitlin saying Mom wanted to meet with me in person to discuss a compromise. No details about what the compromise was, just that Mom was willing to be reasonable if I'd agree to sit down and talk like adults. I didn't respond immediately because I wanted to see how far they'd push it. About 3 hours later, I got another text from Caitlin saying Mom was willing to meet anywhere I wanted. Anytime that worked for me. And please just give them a chance to work this out before lawyers got involved. That last part was interesting. Lawyers. They were already thinking about legal options, which meant they'd probably consulted someone about whether they could fight the eviction. Spoiler alert, they can't, because our rental arrangement was documented and legal, and I'm well within my rights to end it with proper notice. But I was curious what compromise they thought they could offer, so I agreed to meet Mom at a park near my apartment on Wednesday afternoon. Public place, neutral territory, easy for me to leave if it got uncomfortable. Wednesday came and I showed up at the park at 2 p.m. like we'd agreed. Mom was already there sitting on a bench, and I have to say she looked rough, like she'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. Hair not done the way she usually keeps it, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her normal put-together look. Part of me almost felt bad. Almost. She stood up when she saw me and tried to hug me. I stepped back and told her we could talk, but I wasn't doing the physical affection thing. She looked hurt, but nodded and sat back down. I stayed standing. She started by saying she understood I was angry and I had every right to be upset about what happened at the wedding. She said it was inappropriate and hurtful and she should have stopped Caitlin instead of joining in. She said she'd been thinking a lot about how they'd treated me over the years and she could see now that they'd been unfair. All of this sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced this apology in the mirror. I didn't say anything, just waited for her to get to the actual point. Then she pivoted to talking about the house. She explained that she and Dad had been looking at rental listings and everything in their price range was either too far from Dad's work or in neighborhoods that weren't safe or too small for all their furniture. She said 60 days wasn't enough time to find something decent and save up for a deposit and first month's rent, especially since they'd need to hire movers. I pointed out they'd had 10 years to save money for exactly this kind of situation. She said they'd been helping Caitlin with expenses. Apparently, they'd been giving Caitlin $500 a month for the past 3 years to help her save for the wedding and for her and Pierce's down payment on a house. They'd also paid for a good chunk of the wedding itself, about $12,000. So they'd been subsidizing Caitlin's life while paying me below market rent for a house I owned. Great. Mom then said the compromise she wanted to propose was this. They'd pay me an extra $300 a month in rent going forward to bring it up to market rate, and they'd sign a formal lease agreement with a timeline for eventually buying the house from me. She said they'd commit to purchasing it within 5 years, and in the meantime, I'd have guaranteed rental income at a fair rate. I asked what would happen if they didn't buy it in 5 years. She said they would. They'd start saving now. They'd make it work. I asked if she had any of this in writing. She didn't. She said we could draw something up together, make it official, but she wanted to know if I'd consider it before we got lawyers involved in making documents. Here's the thing. The offer wasn't terrible from a purely financial standpoint. Market rate rent plus a guaranteed timeline for sale. But that wasn't the point. The point was that they were trying to negotiate their way out of consequences by offering me money, when what they'd actually done to me had nothing to do with money. I told Mom that I appreciated her coming to talk to me, but I wasn't interested in continuing to be their landlord. I said the house was going on the market and they needed to be out in 51 days. She started crying, asked me what she was supposed to tell Dad, asked where I expected them to go, asked if I understood that this would destroy their credit if they had to break their lease somewhere else or if they missed any bills during the transition. I told her they should have thought about that before they decided to humiliate me at a wedding in front of 200 people. She said it was one mistake and I was punishing them for the rest of their lives over one bad moment. And this is where I actually got angry because she fundamentally didn't understand what was happening. I told her it wasn't one mistake. I walked her through specific incidents over the past decade. The time she introduced me to her book club friends as her son, who was between opportunities when I was steadily employed. The Thanksgiving, when Dad made a whole speech about being grateful for Caitlin's success and didn't mention me once. The Christmas when they got Caitlin a nice piece of jewelry and got me a gift card to a sandwich shop. The countless times they'd made it clear they saw me as the child who didn't live up to expectations. Mom kept trying to interrupt and say those weren't meant the way I took them, that I was being oversensitive, that every family has dynamics and inside jokes. I told her that inside jokes are supposed to be funny to everyone, not just to the people making them. I said the wedding wasn't the reason I was doing this. It was just the justification I'd been waiting for. She asked what that meant, and I explained that I'd been planning for years to eventually cut them off financially and emotionally. And the wedding just gave me the perfect excuse to do it in a way where everyone could see exactly why. Her whole demeanor changed. She stopped crying and got this look like she was finally understanding that this wasn't a negotiation. She asked if I'd been deliberately hiding my career progress from them just to make them look stupid. I said no. I'd just stopped trying to correct their assumptions about who I was. I said they'd decided I was a failure, and I let them think that because it didn't matter what they thought. She said that was manipulative and cruel. I laughed. I actually laughed at her because the irony of her calling me manipulative after spending 34 years manipulating how everyone saw me was too much. She stood up and told me I was going to regret this. That family was forever, and I was burning bridges I'd never be able to rebuild. That when I was older and alone, I'd realize what I'd thrown away. I told her I'd take my chances. She left. I sat on that bench for another 20 minutes, just processing the conversation. Because even though I'd expected her to try to guilt me, hearing her actually say this was all my fault for being oversensitive was clarifying. It confirmed that even now, even facing eviction, she couldn't take actual responsibility for how they'd treated me. That evening, I got a call from Dad. I almost didn't answer, but I figured I might as well hear his version of the appeal. Dad didn't start with an apology. He jumped straight to telling me I was making a huge mistake, and if I went through with the eviction, I'd be proving to everyone that I was exactly the selfish person they'd worried I was becoming. He said Mom told him about our conversation, and he couldn't believe I'd been lying to them for years about my career just to set them up. I corrected him. I hadn't lied about anything. I just hadn't given them details they never asked for. He said that was semantics, and I knew it. He said a good son would have shared his success with his family, instead of hoarding it like some kind of weapon. I asked him when exactly I was supposed to have shared it. Between the times he was telling people I couldn't hold down a job, or maybe during the wedding when he announced to 200 people that I get fired every 6 weeks. He said I was twisting everything to make myself the victim. I said I wasn't the victim. I was just the person with legal ownership of the house they were living in. He started yelling about how I'd trapped them, how I deliberately created this situation so I could have power over them, how I'd turned into someone he didn't recognize. I told him he'd never recognized me to begin with, so nothing had changed there. He hung up on me. Friday morning, I got a notification from my Ring doorbell camera. Someone was at my apartment building entrance. I checked the video, and it was Aunt Gemma, Mom's sister. She was buzzing my apartment number repeatedly. I didn't answer the buzzer. After about 5 minutes, she gave up and left, but not before recording a video message on her phone while standing in front of my building. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see her gesturing emphatically. 20 minutes later, I got a Facebook message request from her again, this time with a video attached. I watched it. She'd basically recorded herself making this appeal about family unity and forgiveness, about how she'd talked to Mom and understood both sides, and how she was begging me to reconsider because this was tearing the whole family apart. I deleted the message request without responding. Saturday was Dad's birthday. I spent the day at the climbing gym with my coworker, Peter, who'd been really cool about everything when I gave him the very abbreviated version of what was happening. It was nice to just do something normal while I knew the birthday party drama was probably unfolding. I was right about the drama. Sunday morning, I woke up to a series of texts from Caitlin that had been sent between midnight and 2 a.m. She'd clearly been at the birthday party and clearly been drinking. The gist of it was that they'd had the party, and about half the usual people showed up. Several of Dad's golf friends had apparently made excuses not to come, and some extended family members had also bailed. The ones who did come kept asking where I was, and when Mom and Dad explained I wasn't there because of a family disagreement, people started asking what kind of disagreement. Mom and Dad apparently tried to keep it vague, but Caitlin, being drunk, told several people the truth, that I was evicting our parents from the house I owned because they'd made jokes about me at her wedding. According to Caitlin's messages, this did not go over well. Some people apparently thought that was an insane overreaction on my part. But several people, including two of Dad's longtime golf buddies, apparently said that publicly humiliating someone at a wedding was pretty messed up and maybe they understood why I was upset. This caused a whole argument at the party about whether what happened at the wedding was really that bad or if I was being too sensitive. The party apparently ended early with people leaving uncomfortable. Caitlin's text blamed me for ruining Dad's birthday. She said I wasn't even there, but I still managed to make everything about me and my hurt feelings. She said I was destroying the family one event at a time. I screenshot the messages and didn't respond. Monday, I got a text from Pierce asking if we could talk on the phone. I called him back during my lunch break. He sounded exhausted. He said the birthday party had been a disaster and Caitlin was spiraling about the whole situation. He said she'd been drinking more than usual and was obsessing over trying to fix things with me. He asked if there was anything at all, that would make me reconsider the eviction. I asked him if Caitlin had actually apologized for what she did at the wedding. He said she'd tried to, but I wouldn't talk to her. I said no, I meant had she sent a genuine apology that took responsibility for her actions without making excuses or blaming me for being sensitive. He was quiet for a minute and then admitted she hadn't. He said she felt terrible, but she also felt like I was escalating things beyond what was reasonable. I told Pierce that was his answer then. As long as Caitlin thought the problem was my reaction rather than her action, there was nothing to talk about. He asked what I wanted her to say. I told him I didn't want her to say anything anymore. The time for apologies was 3 weeks ago. Now I was just following through on a business decision about my property. Pierce said this wasn't business, this was family, and I was using a technicality to punish people I was supposed to love. I told him that people I'm supposed to love aren't supposed to publicly destroy me for entertainment. He didn't have a response to that. We ended the call. It's been 3 days since then. My parents have 42 days left to vacate. I've started getting the house ready to list, contacted a real estate agent, scheduled a property inspection. Everything's moving forward exactly as planned. But here's the new complication, and this is why I'm posting an update. Yesterday, I got a text from Mom saying they'd hired a lawyer to review the rental agreement and explore their options. She said they weren't going to just roll over and let me destroy their lives without a fight. I'm not worried about the legal aspect because I know my rights as a property owner, but it means this is going to get uglier before it gets better. And honestly, I'm ready for it. They've spent 34 years underestimating me. Let them waste money on a lawyer who's going to tell them exactly what I already know. They have no legal recourse. Part 4, coming after I see what their lawyer actually tries. But I wanted you all to know that the birthday party went exactly as badly as predicted, and the family is officially fracturing over this. Final update. Okay, so this is probably going to be my last update on this situation because it's basically reached its conclusion. And honestly, I need to just close this chapter and move on with my life. But you all deserve to know how this ended after following along this whole time. When I left off, my parents had hired a lawyer and I had 42 days left on the eviction timeline. That was about 10 days ago, and everything has moved faster than I expected. The lawyer thing was predictable. I got a formal letter on law firm letterhead delivered to my apartment on a Tuesday. It was very professional, very official looking, and basically argued that our rental arrangement constituted a long-term tenancy that entitled my parents to additional protections beyond standard eviction procedures. The letter requested I extend the move-out deadline to 120 days to allow for adequate time to secure alternative housing, and suggested we enter mediation to discuss a fair resolution. I forwarded the letter to my own lawyer, a guy named Gideon, who handles property law and who I'd consulted with before sending the original eviction notice. He reviewed it and confirmed exactly what I already knew. The letter was posturing. My parents had no legal grounds to demand an extension. The 60-day notice was legally sufficient, our rental agreement was documented and legitimate, and I had every right to terminate it and sell my property. Gideon drafted a response letter explaining this in professional legal language. We sent it back to their lawyer. 2 days later, I got a text from Dad saying they were wasting money they didn't have on a lawyer who couldn't help them, and it was my fault they were going into debt trying to protect themselves from me. I didn't respond to that text, but it confirmed something I'd suspected. They didn't actually have money saved up. After 10 years of below-market rent, after both of them working full-time for 9 of those years, they should have had substantial savings. But between subsidizing Caitlin's life and apparently just living beyond their means, they'd managed to save basically nothing. The next development came from an unexpected direction. Last Thursday, I got a text from Pierce asking if he could come by my apartment to drop something off. No explanation of what it was, just that it would only take a minute of my time. I was curious enough to agree. He showed up that evening carrying a folder. We stood in my apartment building hallway because I wasn't inviting him inside. He looked even more exhausted than he'd sounded on the phone the previous week. He handed me the folder and said Caitlin had put together something she wanted me to see. I opened it and found printouts of text message conversations, what looked like budgets or financial planning documents, and a handwritten letter from Caitlin. Pierce explained that after the birthday party disaster, Caitlin had kind of broken down about the whole situation. She'd apparently spent the past week going through old messages and trying to piece together when exactly she'd started treating me the way she did, and why. The letter was 4 pages long. I skimmed it there in the hallway while Pierce waited. The basic content was Caitlin trying to explain that she'd always felt like she had to be the successful one because that's what our parents valued, and having me as the less successful sibling made her feel secure in her role as the good child. She wrote about how she'd internalized Mom and Dad's attitude toward me and amplified it because it benefited her to have me as a contrast. She admitted the wedding microphone thing wasn't a joke that went wrong. She said she'd planned it, that she'd talked to Mom and Dad beforehand about making some comments about me during the reception, and they'd all agreed it would be funny because I never stood up for myself anyway, so what did it matter? She wrote that she understood now that it did matter, that she'd been cruel, and that she was genuinely sorry. She said she knew an apology didn't fix anything, but she wanted me to know she'd been doing a lot of thinking about the kind of person she'd become, and she didn't like what she saw. The text message printouts were apparently conversations between her and Mom over the past few years where they'd made fun of me, stuff I'd never seen, comments about my social life, my job, my appearance, mean stuff that went way beyond family teasing. Pierce said Caitlin wanted me to have all of it so I could see she wasn't trying to minimize what she'd done anymore. He said she understood I was still going through with the eviction, and she wasn't asking me to change that. She just wanted me to know she finally got it. I asked Pierce why he was the one delivering this instead of Caitlin. He said she was too ashamed to face me, that she'd been having panic attacks about the whole situation and her therapist had suggested writing everything down as a way to process it. I closed the folder and handed it back to him. I told him I appreciated that Caitlin was working through her issues, but I didn't need to be part of that process. I said she could keep her letter and her evidence of being a terrible sister, because I already knew all of that from living it. Pierce asked if there was anything that would make me want to have a relationship with her again in the future. I told him honestly I didn't know. Maybe eventually, but not anytime soon. And definitely not while she was still married to him since he'd spent the past month trying to mediate something that wasn't his business. He looked hurt by that, but nodded. He asked one more time if I'd consider extending the eviction deadline, even just by 30 days. I said no. He left. I threw the folder away without reading the rest of it. That weekend was when things came to a head. Saturday morning, my parents showed up at my apartment building again. The security guard called up and I told him not to let them in, same as every other time. But this time, they didn't leave. They sat down in the lobby and refused to move. The security guard called me back 20 minutes later saying they were still there and insisting they'd wait as long as it took for me to come down and talk to them. He asked if I wanted him to call the police to remove them for trespassing. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to just let him make that call and let them deal with the consequences of their choices. But another part of me was curious what their endgame was here. So I told the guard I'd come down. I went down to the lobby and found both my parents sitting on the couch near the entrance. Mom's eyes were red like she'd been crying. Dad looked angry. I stayed standing near the elevator where I could leave easily if I needed to. Dad started by saying they'd come to make one final appeal before things got to a point where the family couldn't recover. He said they'd accepted the eviction was happening and they'd started looking at apartments. But they needed help with the moving costs and the deposit on a new place. And they wanted to know if I'd be willing to give them the first month's rent I'd collected after they moved out as a loan to help them get settled. I asked why I would do that. Mom said because we were family, and because they'd raised me, and because this was their chance to prove they could take responsibility and rebuild trust. I pointed out they'd had 10 years to take responsibility and rebuild trust, and they'd chosen to spend that time making fun of me instead. Dad said I needed to stop bringing up ancient history and focus on solving the current problem. I told him the current problem was entirely of their making, and I wasn't responsible for solving it. Mom started crying harder and said they were going to end up in some terrible apartment in a bad neighborhood because that's all they could afford with their credit scores and their lack of savings. And did I really want that on my conscience? I told her my conscience was fine. I reminded her that they'd both been employed for 9 years, and if they'd saved even a fraction of what they should have, they wouldn't be in this position. I brought up the $500 a month they'd been giving Caitlin, the $12,000 they'd spent on her wedding. I asked why they thought it was my job to subsidize their poor financial planning. Dad got up from the couch. He said I'd become someone he didn't recognize. Someone cold and calculating who valued money over family. He said the son he'd raised would never treat his parents this way. And that's when I finally said what I'd been holding back for weeks. I told him he'd never actually raised a son who existed. He'd created this imaginary version of me in his head. This failure who needed constant correction and disappointment. And he'd been so committed to that version that he'd never bothered to learn who I actually was. I said the person standing in front of him right now was who I'd always been. He'd just been too arrogant to notice. I told both of them that they'd spent 34 years making me feel small so they could feel big. And the wedding was just the most public example of a pattern that had been going on my entire life. I said I'd given them a place to live at below market rent for a decade, and they'd never once thanked me or acknowledged that generosity. They'd just kept treating me like I was barely competent to exist. I said I was done. Done trying to earn respect I was never going to get. Done watching them give Caitlin everything while giving me scraps and criticism. Done being the family punching bag. Mom said I was exaggerating, that we'd had good times too, that I was choosing to only remember the negative. I asked her to name one time in the past 10 years when they'd treated me with genuine respect. She couldn't. She just cried harder. Dad said this was exactly what he was talking about, that I was being cold and cruel and turning everything into an attack. I told him I was being honest for the first time in years, and if he experienced that as an attack, it said more about him than it did about me. Then, I went back upstairs to my apartment. They stayed in the lobby for another hour before finally leaving. That was 6 days ago. Since then, I've gotten a few more text messages from various family members, but nothing from Mom, Dad, or Caitlin directly. The eviction timeline continues. They have 32 days left as of today. The house is officially listed now. My real estate agent thinks we'll get multiple offers once it hits the market properly next week. The property is in good shape and it's in a desirable area. I'll probably make about $90,000 profit after paying off the remaining balance on the loan I took to buy out Caitlin's half 10 years ago. I've started thinking about what I want to do with that money. Maybe a down payment on my own house. Maybe invest it. Maybe take a trip somewhere I've never been. The point is, it's mine to decide. And I earned it by being patient for 10 years while everyone underestimated me. Some of you have asked if I feel guilty or if I think I went too far. Honest answer? No. What I did was use the power I had in the only situation where I had any. They spent decades having power over how I was perceived, and they used it to diminish me at every opportunity. I spent 6 years building actual power in my life, and I used it to establish boundaries they couldn't ignore. Did I know evicting them would be harsh? Yes. Did I care? Not enough to change my decision. Because here's what I've realized through all of this. They never cared about being harsh to me. They never worried about whether their comments were too much or their jokes went too far. They said and did whatever they wanted because they assumed I'd always be there to absorb it. The wedding microphone incident wasn't the worst thing they ever did to me. It was just the most public, and therefore the most useful. It gave me something undeniable to point to when people asked why I was cutting them off. It gave me justification that even strangers could understand. But the truth is, I would have done this eventually anyway. The wedding just accelerated the timeline. As for Caitlin's letter and her apparent revelation about her own behavior, I genuinely don't care. Maybe she's grown as a person. Maybe she's just scared of losing her scapegoat. Either way, it doesn't change anything for me. She participated in humiliating me at her wedding because it benefited her to keep me in my designated role as the family failure. Now she gets to live with the consequences of that choice. Pierce texted me yesterday, asking if I'd be willing to meet with Caitlin one more time before the eviction was final. He said she's been struggling and could really use closure. I told him closure is something you give yourself, not something you get from other people. I haven't heard back from him since. My coworker Peter asked me last week if I thought I'd regret this decision in 10 years. I told him I'd been regretting staying connected to my family for the past 15 years, so this felt like an improvement. He laughed and bought me lunch. So that's where things stand. My parents are scrambling to find an apartment they can afford. Caitlin is apparently in therapy processing her role in the family dysfunction. Pierce is trying to hold his new marriage together while his wife falls apart over losing her scapegoat brother. And I'm just living my life the way I have been for the past 6 years, working my job, hanging out with Gideon, making plans for a future that doesn't include people who treated me like I was worthless. The wedding was 5 weeks ago. In 4 more weeks, my parents will be out of the house. The property will sell within a month or two after that, and then this entire chapter of my life will be closed. I spent 6 years waiting for the moment when I could finally show my family exactly who I'd become while they weren't paying attention. The moment came. I executed the plan I'd been building toward, and now I get to watch them realize that the person they thought they could publicly humiliate without consequences actually had all the power in this situation the whole time. Was it worth it? Ask me again when the house sells and I'm sitting on $90,000 they could have shared in if they'd just treated me with basic respect. Yeah, it was worth it. Thanks for following along with this mess, everyone. And to anyone out there dealing with family members who treat you like you're less than, you don't owe them your presence just because you share DNA. Build your own life, get your power together, and when they finally push you too far, don't be afraid to use it.